So I'll now give my talk. Thank you, David, for organizing the sessions and all the other colleagues here in the audience. So I'll talk a bit about learning from dialoguing with and integrating indigenous or peasant and academic knowledge systems. I will briefly mention the partial overlaps methodology without entering into much detail, but the goal is to reach a more nuanced analysis of the relations between knowledge systems. On the one hand, trying to analyze ontological, epistemological, and axiological overlaps that may provide common grounds for collaboration and mutual learning. On the other hand, also analyze the partialities of overlap, as just Vitor said some minutes ago, that is the substantial differences in ontological, epistemological, and axiological dimensions. And we argue, I will not argue much about this, but in the case of the differences, it's crucial the political positioning of the researcher in relation to cultural diversity. If we try to ask how can you pursue knowledge dialogue and co-production through partial overlaps, one first question is that this methodology has nothing to do with trying to validate the knowledge of others, systems, but it's just about opening up space for collaboration, mutual learning, and empowerment. And then we avoid testimonial or epistemic injustice. There is the idea of requiring indigenous and local knowledge to be validated through academic knowledge criteria, but not so often academic knowledge to be validated through agreement with indigenous and local knowledge. As a good science is not value-free, a science is not value-free, that's not controversial in the philosophy of science, it follows that good science should be also transparent about the role of values in their methodological decisions. And then in the case of the partial overlap frameworks, we argue that it should assume values stemming from an intercultural attitude. To understand an intercultural attitude, we use a typology proposed by Rist and Adugueba. I cannot explain due to time all the categories. I'll focus on the intercultural attitude, but they describe an acknowledging attitude towards local knowledge, and utilitarian attitude, a paternalistic attitude, a neo-colonial attitude, an essentialist attitude, and we try to go for the intercultural attitude that recognizes that there are many different knowledge systems. Science is one of them, but also doesn't take a relativistic view on knowledge systems because it assumes that knowledge is always embedded in cultural and historical settings, and thus knowledge systems develop to be more prone to solve certain constellations of problems than others. So different kinds of knowledge systems address better different kinds of knowledge than we can compare on a pragmatic ground given a concrete situated problem. And that's one of the reasons why science and local knowledge can benefit from comprehensive interaction. Epistemic injustice, if we are tending towards a validation attitude, this will favor either an acknowledging utilitarian, paternalistic, or neo-colonial perspectives. But as I said, the partial overlaps methodology necessarily involves an intercultural attitude. And I'll try to look now at some field work on Siribinha. This is Mario Sergio, one of the traditional experts we work with, in which we look at overlaps in epistemology. I cannot describe the methodology in detail because of the time, or you can go back to this in discussion. So we took as a starting point the work by David Ludwig and Luana Policelli on how we could go beyond the divide between traditional and academic ecological knowledge by looking at similar and different heuristic tools used in these two knowledge systems. And then we built some scenarios to go to the field and try to discuss with the traditional experts how they explain some phenomena. So for instance, we look at how they explain the fact that this bivalve Massunin appears and disappears in the estuary, and it was quite clear that they were using causal explanation quite similarly to how academic scientists use causal explanation. But I'll look more at another scenario which has to do with mechanisms, and I'll take as a basic idea of mechanism here the minimum account of mechanism by Hilarie and Williamson, in which they argue that a mechanism is a set of entities and activities organized in such a way that they are responsible for a phenomenon. And we asked them how they would explain the Robalo waters, that's how they call periods when a lot of snook is captured in the estuarine waters. And when we analyzed the interviews, we got something that's quite similar to a mechanistic explanation as done in academic science. I cannot explain the model now. We can go back to this in discussion, but we have several different factors. Some of them are inhibitory, the red lines. Some of them are facilitating, the green lines. And we have different pathways to lead to the same phenomenon, the Robalo water. So that's quite a complex explanation. But then we ask, so what's happening when we find an overlap between how fishers and academic sites explain? When we say they're doing causal explanation, they're doing something like mechanistic explanation, well, we need to be reflexive about the very act of intercultural translation. When we find overlaps, we are not mapping between entities, properties, relations, and so forth that are shared by distinct knowledge systems. We are rather point to similarities between what we do in academic knowledge and what fishers do in indigenous or local knowledge that can be interpretatively regarded as sufficiently similar to open up a space for taking seriously what the holders of local knowledge know, for instance, for management or for conservation purposes. And then I will finish by trying to speak a bit about this question. How can you learn from and with other knowledge systems? So one way is we can learn from overlaps, as they suggest shared meaning-making spaces for collaborative learning. But can we also learn from partialities of overlaps, particularly when we speak in cases of radical alterity? If we look, for instance, in when a radical alterity case, like the idea by the Runa of Ecuador's Upper Amazon that forests are thinking agents, on the one hand, we can think, well, there's no convergence between this idea and the Western ideas on cognitive systems. But yet, at least part of the Westerners will find the idea of thinking forests is simply fascinating. And this means there will be at least enough ontological overlap for thinking forests to be intelligible for a Westerner. Then, even though we cannot deny limits in ontological overlap, even though we have here deep transcultural differences, we do not have fully fledged incommensurability. Then we can learn, even in the case of radical alterity. But it can go beyond that. We can learn through what Viveiros de Castro, Brazilian anthropologist, call controlled equivocation. So if you consider the caipora, I cannot explain much on the caipora now, but that's a master of animals and an entity that regenerates animals in the forest and punishes those that insults animals, and is a concept of very broad circulation among Amazonian Amerindians. And certainly we don't find caiporas in the Western ontology. So some academic, less prone to an intercultural attitude, might be tempted to ask, does caipora exist? And he or she could answer, no, it doesn't exist. Then what means is that we are simply answering that from our ontological perspective, and we are blocking the road for further inquiry and learning. Well, but this is not what we expect from an inquiring attitude. Here we have only a power relation in which we simply impose our ontology on the ontology of others. And this is simply a unfruitful answer that's to be dismissed because the question is unfruitful, if something exists or not. But if you think now about how this master of animal regulates human-nature relation, and how in this regulation there is a complex interplay between ontology, values, and epistemology, we can ask different questions. What can we learn from taking caiporas seriously? What is it like to believe caiporas to exist? Then we can open up a road for further inquiry and learning, which might lead to even more interesting questions. For instance, what might we do differently in our societies if we believed in caiporas? Well, if we look at the work by Viveiros de Castro, he'll give us a criteria for what he calls a good intercultural translation. Would be a translation that allows others' concepts to deform and subvert the translator conceptual toolbox. In this case, translation is understood as a controlled equivocation. We are wrong when we translate. But if we do systematically, methodically, then we have controlled equivocation. And controlled equivocation is great because it can generate productive misunderstandings. And then we can ask what might follow from opening up through overlaps a space for mutual learning between academic knowledge and indigenous local knowledge holders that leads us to more of this translation as controlled equivocation. Might we share each other's experience and then talk together about a novel, emergent perspective, open up but the subversion of our distinctive conceptual toolbox, as we are subverted by the indigenous local knowledge holders and they are subverted by us. What happens then? The other of the others will always be other, and neither we nor they will be saying what we are saying before. But the great question is what novel things may we be saying together when we deform and subvert each other? That's it. Thanks for the attention.